When you are comparing options, 2 smartphones, 2 vacation packages, 2 job offers, of course you're going to notice the similarities, but it's the differences that will likely help you make a decision. It's the differences that will indicate whether one is better or worse than another. And contrast language in English helps us talk about the differences. Recently, I did a lesson focused on the language we use to compare, to show similarities. But in this Confident English lesson today, we're going to focus on 7 ways to show contrast, the language we use to do that, the linking words that allow us to create sentence structures to highlight what's different. If you're trying to explain someone what your options are and asking them to help you make a choice, contrast language will help you do that. But first, if you don't already know, I'm Anne-Marie, an English confidence and fluency coach. Everything I do is designed to help you get the confidence you want for your life and work in English. If you'd love to get past Confident English lessons of mine, including that lesson on language we use to show similarities, you can find all of them at my Speak Confident English website. While you're there, you can also download my in-depth How to Say What You Want in English training. In that training, I'll share with you one simple strategy you can use to get speaking practice so that you don't feel stuck in conversations and to help you develop overall confidence and fluency. Now, just in case you missed my previous lesson on the topic of making comparisons, I want to share 2 quick things. Number 1, I'll leave a link to that lesson in the notes below. And number 2, let's do a quick review of what linking words are, because that is the focus of this lesson. Linking words are also known as transitional words or connectors. What that means is they help us connect one sentence to another or link one idea to another. They build a bridge between those sentences and ideas. And as a result, we have a logical connection. So if you're speaking and sharing ideas, you might start talking about one idea and over time begin talking about another. It's those linking words, those bridges in the middle that help make that connection and create that smooth flow while speaking. The words that you're going to learn today will help you do that when you're talking about your options and you need to highlight the differences. To do that, you're going to learn how to use in contrast to, on the other hand, whereas, as opposed to, unlike, different from, and not as. At the end, I also want to talk about using the words more than and less than. And of course, with each one of these, I'm going to share example sentences with you so that you can see how to use them with accurate structure, with accurate grammatical structure. So with that, let's begin with in contrast to. When we want to make a smooth transition in a sentence to highlight a difference or introduce an opposing idea, we can use in contrast to. And like other examples that you'll see here today, we can use this in the middle of the sentence or at the beginning of a sentence. Now, as you'll see in the examples I share with you, if you're going to use in contrast to at the beginning, in writing, we'll use a comma at the end of that clause before going on to the next one. In speaking, we'll insert a slight pause. For example, in contrast to my sister who prefers the summer, I prefer the fall. There was a little pause there between those clauses, and if I were to put that in writing, I would use a comma. And before I share another example with you, I want to look specifically at how we can use this to create a link between sentences, to have that nice smooth transition. I could have 2 separate sentences. For example, this summer has been quite warm. Last summer wasn't as warm. Using the words in contrast to, I can combine these 2 sentences into one elegant sentence with a smooth transition. In contrast to last year, this summer has been quite warm. Let's try another. I'm going to give you 2 sentences, and then I'm going to pause for a moment, and I want you to think about how you would use in contrast to combine them into one. The first sentence, older generations often prefer traditional music. The second sentence, younger generations do not. How would you combine those 2 sentences using in contrast to? One option, older generations often prefer traditional music, in contrast to younger generations. At the start of this section, I used the sentence, in contrast to my sister who prefers summer, I prefer fall. If I were to split that into 2 separate sentences, they could be, my sister prefers summer, I prefer fall. For the last example, I want you to combine those sentences and this time put the words in contrast to in the middle. My original example put them at the beginning, but how could we put them in the middle? Here's my example. I prefer fall in contrast to my sister who prefers summer. And now the second linking phrase is on the other hand. Similar to the words in contrast to, this phrase is used to indicate an opposing view or idea. And it's often used in brainstorming discussions when you want to reflect on different viewpoints or consider different suggestions. For example, the company might save money by outsourcing, but on the other hand, it may lose control over quality. Here's a second example. If I take this new job offer, I'll have the opportunity to travel a lot for work, which I really enjoy. On the other hand, I'm up for a rather generous promotion at my current company. I really don't know what to do. Let's take a moment to practice this one. I want you to think about whether you're trying to make a difficult decision right now, or perhaps you're trying to find the right way forward on a project and you have a few options. How might you use this linking phrase, on the other hand, to indicate these opposing views, these opposing opportunities, or these different options? If you want, you can share your example sentence with me in the comments below. And now, linking word number 3, whereas. Whereas is often used in written English and in more formal conversations. It can be used to introduce an opposing or contrasting statement, especially if you're comparing opposing ideas, conditions, or facts. Here are 2 example sentences of how you would use it. Cutting costs would be a good course of action for our business, whereas taking on another expense would strain us. Just as we highlighted earlier, I could split this sentence into 2 separate sentences. However, because it is a bridge or a connection, it allows us to put these 2 ideas into one sentence and highlight the contrast or the opposing ideas, the opposing realities. Here's another example, and this time we'll put it at the beginning of the sentence. Whereas company profits skyrocketed last quarter, employee satisfaction plummeted. Now, if you're not sure, if something skyrockets, it increases rapidly and dramatically. If something plummets, it falls or drops rapidly and dramatically. So we have 2 opposing actions happening here. Next on our list is as opposed to. We typically use this one to indicate contrasting choices or preferences when we have options. For example, I prefer coffee as opposed to tea. If someone gives me 2 options, I'm indicating my preference of one for the other. Here's another example. The company decided to invest in sustainable packaging as opposed to single-use plastics. And a third example, she decided to pursue a career in IT as opposed to human resources. In each of those 3 examples, we have a choice to make, and there are options available to us. The words opposed to help us highlight the preferences or distinguish what we prefer. Before we go on to our 5th example, I want to give you 2 practice opportunities. First, I want you to think about a past decision you made. It might be your choice of careers, or perhaps your choice of what university to attend. Maybe you had 2 job offers, and again, you had to make a choice. How would you use as opposed to indicate your preference in that decision? And if it's helpful, you can follow the example. She decided to pursue a career in IT as opposed to human resources. And now here's a second practice option, and this time we're also going to focus on the placement of these words. I'm going to share an example sentence with you, and I'll put as opposed to in the middle. I want you to rearrange the sentence and put those words at the beginning. Here's the example sentence. Sarah has decided to stay 1 month longer in Indonesia as opposed to traveling home next week. How would you rearrange that sentence and put as opposed to at the beginning? If you're not sure, here's how you could do it. As opposed to traveling home next week, Sarah has decided to stay in Indonesia, or Sarah has decided to stay in Indonesia for a month longer. And now linking word number 5, unlike. This is a simple, straightforward way to highlight differences, or how two things are not alike. You could use it if you're comparing the differences between items, people, or ideas. And of course, it's used to emphasize that two things are not similar. They are not alike. For example, unlike her brother, she enjoys playing soccer and participating in outdoor sports. Or, unlike previous years, we're expecting a short, mild winter. Now, because it's very similar, I want to move directly on to the next one, different from. Just like the word unlike, the words different from help us highlight the differences or variations. However, it's more neutral in tone. Rather than emphasize a difference, it focuses on variation. In other words, you could think about the word unlike, indicating strong differences, almost black and white differences, whereas the words different from might focus more on the variations, the different shades of gray. For example, perhaps you're having a discussion on how your current boss approaches problem solving, and you are highlighting the fact that it's different from how a previous boss approached this issue. You don't want to indicate that one is particularly good or bad. You don't want to indicate that they are vastly different. Instead, you simply want to state that they aren't alike, but that doesn't mean that one is better than the other. Here's how we could do that. Her approach to problem solving is different from Greta's approach. It doesn't mean that it's better or worse. It's just different. It's another variation. Another example, the climate in this region of the United States is different from what I'm used to. Again, it doesn't mean that it's better or worse. It's just different. It's a variation. And now, number 7 on our list, not as. Here we typically use an adjective or an adverb in this structure. Not as beautiful as, not as quickly as. When we use this structure, we typically use it to highlight that something is less than or inferior to another. For example, today is not as warm as yesterday. It's less warm than it was yesterday. Another example, I'm not as fond of spicy food as you are. Again, I'm less fond of spicy food. And a third example, this software is not as effective as the older version. In other words, it's inferior. Now, when using this particular structure, we have to be careful of something. We have to be careful to avoid double negatives. What that means is we don't want to repeat the word not or the word no. For example, here's a mistake I've seen before. This movie is not as good, not his last one. Here we've got that word not repeated twice, so we have a double negative. Here's how to make it correct. This movie is not as good as his last one. Now, before we get to our final practice activity, I want to talk a little bit about using the words more than and less than. In our previous example, using not as, We highlighted that this can be used to show that something is less than another or inferior to another. And without a doubt, we can use the words more than or less than when we want to highlight the differences. This is particularly helpful when we want to highlight the quantity or the degree to which something is different. More than typically indicates that something exceeds something else. And less than might be used to show that something has fallen short. For example, her report was less focused and detailed than his report was. In other words, it fell short. It was inferior to his report. Another example, the company's proposal offered a more generous timeline than the others. We'll be moving forward with the sale soon. Of course, in this example with more than, we're indicating that one proposal exceeded or was far better than another. And here's one final example. The restaurant was less impressive than we expected. Now that you have these 7 different examples of linking words and phrases that help you make contrasts in English, allowing you to highlight differences, talk about them with others, and hopefully make a better decision, let's do a quick quiz. I have a couple of sentences here. I want you to fill in the blanks, and if you want my answers, you can find them in the comments below. Honestly, I was disappointed. The movie was good. I thought it would be. I expected it to be action-packed and engaging. It was. What do you think? If you want one more practice opportunity, here's a question for you. I want you to think about a recent situation when you had to make a choice between 2 things. How would you use the word whereas to help you explain your preference or to help you explain why you made a particular choice? As always, you can share your example sentence with me in the comments below. Now, if you found today's lesson helpful, I would love to know, and you can tell me in one very simple way. Give this lesson a thumbs up here on YouTube. And while you're at it, make sure you subscribe to my Speak Confident English channel so you never miss one of my Confident English lessons. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time.